They were young. They were brave. They fought a war they didn't start, and came home to a silence louder than gunfire. These are the forgotten soldiers of Vietnam, the men and women who gave everything and received nothing in return. What happened to them after the last helicopter left Saigon? What stories were buried beneath the jungle mud and the silence of a nation that wanted to forget? Today, we uncover the truth, the real, heart-shattering stories of those who were never truly welcomed home. The Vietnam War was one of the most controversial and painful chapters in modern history. Fought between 1955 and 1975, it wasn't just a battle between North and South Vietnam. It was a clash of ideologies, between communism and democracy, between hope and despair. But beneath all the politics, the soldiers, the human beings, were the ones who paid the ultimate price. More than 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam. Over 58,000 never came back. But even those who did survive often said, part of them never left the jungle. For years, their names were forgotten, their sacrifices ignored, and their pain silenced. They were soldiers who fought not only enemies in the battlefield, but also nightmares in their own minds. Imagine being 19 years old, sent to a foreign jungle where every leaf could hide a sniper, and every sound could mean death. You don't know who the enemy is, because in Vietnam, the enemy wasn't always wearing a uniform. Villagers could smile in the morning and set traps by night. Soldiers lived in constant fear, not of dying, but of not knowing when it would happen. One forgotten soldier, named Private James Walker, once wrote in his journal, "You don't die once in Vietnam. You die every night before you sleep." James survived the war, but when he came back home, he found something even worse: rejection. Instead of parades and medals, many returning soldiers were called killers or monsters. Protesters spat on them. Employers refused to hire them. Their own country wanted to erase them from memory, to pretend the war never happened. But how do you erase a war from the mind of someone who lived through it? Many of these soldiers suffered from what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, though back then, it didn't even have a name. They had flashbacks of the jungle, panic attacks at loud noises, and guilt for surviving when their friends didn't. Some turned to alcohol or drugs to escape the memories. Some ended their own lives, and some simply disappeared. One of the most haunting stories is that of Sergeant Michael Harlan. He was a decorated soldier, a hero who saved his entire squad during an ambush near Khe Sanh. But when he returned home, he couldn't sleep. He heard screams in the dark. He wrote letters to his fallen brothers, apologizing that he couldn't save them all. In 1978, 3 years after the war ended, Michael drove his car into the woods, parked near a lake, and never came out. They found his dog tags hanging from a tree, a silent reminder that the war never really ended for him. But not all forgotten soldiers were American. Thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers who fought alongside the U.S. were abandoned when America withdrew. When Saigon fell in 1975, many of these men were thrown into re-education camps, tortured for years while their families starved. Some managed to escape on overcrowded boats, becoming refugees drifting in the South China Sea. Their bravery, their loyalty, forgotten by the world. One survivor, Tran Minh, later said, "We were called traitors in our own land and ghosts by the Americans. We had no home left, not in Vietnam, not in memory." There were also stories of the Montagnards, an indigenous tribe in Vietnam's Central Highlands. They helped American soldiers navigate the dense jungles, risking their lives to save countless U.S. troops, but when the war ended, they were hunted down by the new regime. Many were executed, few were ever rescued. Decades later, American veterans still fight to bring their Montagnard brothers to safety, a promise made in blood. Then there were the POWs, prisoners of war, men captured by the North Vietnamese and kept in brutal camps like the infamous Hanoi Hilton. They endured years of torture, starvation, and isolation. Some returned home after years in captivity. Others never did. One such soldier, Captain John Reynolds, was listed as missing in action in 1968. His wife waited 20 years, writing letters every week, hoping for news. In 1989, a farmer discovered his dog tags near an unmarked grave deep in the jungle. The war had ended decades ago, but for his family, time had stood still. And then there are stories that break you even deeper, stories of soldiers who found humanity in the heart of war. One soldier, Corporal David Lee, was on patrol when his unit accidentally injured a Vietnamese child. Instead of walking away, David carried that child 5 miles to a field hospital under heavy fire. He later said, "That day, I realized we were all victims of the same war." There were also medics, young men barely out of high school, who spent every day holding dying soldiers, whispering to them that everything would be okay. Many of them returned home haunted by the faces they couldn't save. One nurse, Ellen Rogers, served at a field hospital near Da Nang. She treated hundreds of wounded soldiers, watching life slip away in her hands every day. When she came home, no one asked her what she saw. No one said thank you. Decades later, she said, "The blood washed off my hands, but not from my heart." The Vietnam War was fought on TV screens as much as on battlefields. It was the first war the world watched in real time. Every night, living rooms were filled with images of burning villages, crying children, and body bags. People began to question, why were we fighting? Who were we helping? And as the protests grew louder, the soldiers felt more and more isolated. They didn't choose the war. They were drafted, ordered, sent. Many didn't even understand where Vietnam was on a map. But when they returned home, the anger that people had toward the government fell on them. Even years later, when memorials were built, their pain wasn't over. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C., bears over 58,000 names. Visitors often see veterans standing there silently, their fingers tracing the names of friends they once laughed with. Some bring medals, letters, or photos, some just cry. That black granite wall reflects not only the faces of the fallen, but the ghosts of those who survived. Among those names are forgotten heroes like Private Danny Carter, who jumped on a grenade to save his squad. Lieutenant Sarah Jennings, one of the first female nurses killed in action. And Corporal Luis Ramirez, who stayed behind to cover his team's escape, and was never seen again. These are the stories that never made it into textbooks. The stories of ordinary people caught in an extraordinary nightmare. But here's something even more haunting. Over 1,500 soldiers from the U.S. are still officially missing. Even today, recovery teams search the jungles of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia to bring their remains home. For families, every phone call could be the one that ends decades of waiting. For some, it never comes. And what about the Vietnamese soldiers? Millions of them died too, many fighting for a cause they didn't fully understand. Farmers became soldiers. Sons left their families, never to return. Mothers buried empty coffins because there were no bodies left to bury. The jungles of Vietnam are not just green, they're soaked in tears. But from this pain, stories of redemption also emerged. American veterans have returned to Vietnam to build schools, hospitals, and memorials. Some have met the families of men they once fought against. They've planted trees where they once dropped bombs. One veteran said, "I came back to make peace, not with them, but with myself." In one powerful meeting, an American soldier met a former Viet Cong fighter. Both had lost friends. Both had nightmares. They sat together, shared a meal, and cried. The American said, "We were enemies once. Now we're survivors." These acts of reconciliation show that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity can find a way to heal. But still, many soldiers never found that peace. Thousands of veterans in America still live on the streets. Many still fight invisible wars in their minds. The sound of helicopters, fireworks, or even rain can bring back the screams of battle. Every night, they relive moments that the world has forgotten. The war may have ended in 1975, but for them, it never did. We must remember, the forgotten soldiers of Vietnam weren't just numbers or uniforms. They were sons, daughters, fathers, friends. They had dreams to go to college, to fall in love, to grow old. Instead, they became shadows in history. Their stories remind us that the cost of war isn't paid on the battlefield. It is paid in broken hearts, shattered minds, and lives that never truly heal. When you see a veteran, don't look away. Don't see a soldier, see a survivor. Someone who faced the worst of humanity and came back trying to find the best in it again. The Vietnam War taught the world many lessons about politics, power, and pride. But its greatest lesson is this: no soldier should ever come home to silence. No sacrifice should ever be forgotten.